Jackie Robinson, and Yogi Berra. 3 very popular names in the sports world who did a lot for baseball. But have you ever heard of Dottie Kamenchek, Betty Weaver, Anastasia Batikis, or even Shirley Jameson? These women and many more changed the gender roles of baseball and gave the country hope during one of its toughest hours. Let's go back to the 1940s and see exactly what these American heroes did for their generation and the future.
That All-American pastime, baseball, brings out the All-American Girl Baseball League for spring training at Alexandria, Virginia. 2 teams are working out, the Fort Wayne Daisies and the Racine Bells, getting in shape for an opening day doubleheader. Dottie Schroeder is quite confident that her hair won't get in her eyes. And keeping her eye on the ball is catcher Kate Von Drove. Okay, gals, play ball.
The All-American Girls Professional Baseball League started in 1943. They started during World War II to help with, the men were off at sea fighting and men's baseball was kind of dying. So the women started with their league. In the 1940s, the women's professional baseball team was instrumental in, really picking up and providing entertainment when the nation was at war. Their best teams toured the country and played exhibitions, sometimes against men's baseball teams to help raise money for the war causes. And to raise morale around the country too. So there were, a lot of incidents that it was one way that women could help with the war back on the home front.
Philip Wrigley, owner of the Chicago Cubs, was the man who came up with the idea of women's baseball as a way to keep the sport alive as the men were overseas at war. During popular years, the teams attracted between 2,000 to 3,000 fans to a single game. The league peaked in its attendance during the 1948 season when 10 teams attracted 910,000 paid fans. There were 15 teams throughout the 12 years of the league. They were the Kenosha Comets, the Racine Bells, the Rockford Peaches, the South Bend Blue Sox, the Milwaukee Chicks, the Minneapolis Merlettes, Fort Wayne Daisies, Grand Rapid Chicks, Muskegon Lassies, Peoria Red Wings, Chicago Colliens, the Springfield Sallies, the Kalamazoo Lassies, and the Battle Creek Bells.
My aunt was in the Air Force during World War II, and she played on the military women's baseball team. It was made up of women from different branches, and they traveled around the country and played exhibitions against male baseball teams, and they would beat them pretty often. She always said that there were a lot of fans that came out to watch those games, and people couldn't believe how good the women were. It was very popular at the time, and it helped raise funds for the war, and it also provided a little distraction to families who were maybe concerned that they have loved ones off fighting.
When thinking about women's roles in the 1940s, we have to kind of split the time period in half, split the decade in half. During the war years, in the first half, from about 1940 to 1945, women actually enjoyed expanded presence in the public sphere and in the economy, many of them going to work in jobs that were left behind by men who were serving overseas. However, when the war ended and men came home, they expected to have those jobs that they'd had before waiting for them, and so we see a major push in American society to return women to what were seen as traditional roles of domesticity, maybe even more so than before the war.
Competitive. They took women from all over the country and tried to find the best women that they could. They wanted it to be a women's version of Major League Baseball. The women were paid $50 a week when they started off, which was pretty good at the time. And that changed throughout as attendance rose and sank, and player salaries went up and down. With the uniforms that they wore were heavy cotton uniforms, and they all wore skirts. They were they had visors, and they were supposed to be dressed pretty nice, and their physical appearance was very important. almost as important as the way they played. They were sent to charm schools because they wanted to maintain the image of still being ladies. They thought that that's what the fans wanted to see, and they thought that that was what would keep the interest of the men, who would come to the games. They wanted to see female players playing baseball and doing that.
Women's sexuality, for the most part, is controlled by men and is controlled by the expectations of women to, especially once they were married, to remain at home and to kind of be part of the family, to fit into that kind of wife and mother role. Of course, there are much more sexualized images of women in the media, but there's kind of a double standard there. Again, if you go back to the 1920s, you see something of a reversal from those roles, and women taking more control of their own sexuality and their place in society. But by the 40s, that has, again, kind of fallen off.
It was good. It gave women a role, I believe, in America and at the war. While most of the men were overseas fighting, many of the women were back home taking up the jobs of the men. And I definitely think that gave them the opportunity to show that they can do the same type of work. And I think it definitely helped with women's rights at that time. I think that, it definitely is a precursor to women's softball. That generation, the people who started to really popularize women's baseball, they were all, parents or grandparents in the 70s and 80s when women's softball and girls softball really started to pick up on the high school and college level. Softball teams always existed, throughout the 20th century, but popularity really increased in the 70s and 80s. And I think that, those, mothers and grandmothers, the ones who started playing baseball and who had an interest in that, passed that along onto their daughters. I think it's been growing in popularity without question. The Women's College World Series is very popular on ESPN. Just regular season women's softball is starting to be on TV a lot more. And women that do very well in college have more opportunities going forward. ESPN just hired Jessica Mendoza, who is a very good softball player and very popular as a baseball analyst. And that's a familiar name to people. I think if you went back 10 or 15 years ago, there were no household softball player names. Now people know who Jessica Mendoza is, people know who Jenny Finch is. So I definitely think it's moving in the right direction. I kind of started dying down in the early 50s, I believe, probably maybe right from the late 40s into the early 50s. Attendance started shrinking because a lot of the major leaguers were returning from World War II, and Major League Baseball was becoming popular again. So, attendance started to drift a little bit. The league didn't spread and it didn't expand into places where they thought that it might, and they ran into financial problems. They tried to offset some of those problems by decreasing salary and contracting some teams, but attendance never picked up, and eventually the league died out.